and welcome to the webcast, Reaching the Online Travel Consumer in China and Avoiding Failure. We want to welcome PhoCusWright, which is a market research and industry intelligence firm, as our main presenter today. Just a couple of housekeeping notes to start with. Turn on your computer speakers for the audio. We welcome questions via the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen or on the left. Please enter any questions you want throughout the presentation. We'll get to those at the end. The presentation will be recorded, and you will get a recording of that emailed to you, the link to the recording. So I'm Sharon Bell. I'm Director of Marketing at CD Networks, and I want to welcome our featured speaker, Douglas Quinby, who is the Vice President of Research at PhoCusWright. At PhoCusWright, he is a key contributor to the Global Edition, Special Projects, and Custom Research, and he oversees the Asia-Pacific Edition. He has led several studies on social media, traveler reviews, travel agencies, vacation market, US and Europe, local tours and activities market, global distribution systems, and more. And he's frequently cited in leading media outlets, including Bloomberg, CNN, the New York Times, USA Today, Wall Street Journal, and Washington Post. Welcome, Douglas, and please get started.
Great. Well, thank you, Sharon, and welcome, everyone. So I think that it's still very common, and frankly, it amazes me that very often when we talk about China as a market, the context is often as an emerging marketplace, and it's often lumped in with kind of the rest of Asia or the BRIC markets as this emerging environment with tremendous potential and opportunity. But I really today disagree with that very much. I think that China is an emerged market. China has risen, and the opportunity by no means is tomorrow. It is absolutely today. Just to give you a little bit of context, let's just look at just the size of the market. So there are 256 million travelers in China. So that's 250 million travelers. Now, what exactly is a traveler? So we define this as an adult who has flown by commercial air or stayed in paid accommodation for a leisure or personal trip at least 75 miles from home. So we're excluding rail actually for China. We're talking about flyers or hotel stayers. So 256 million. It seems like a really big number, but of course these days, any number that comes out of China is really big. So let's put some context around that, right? As a point of comparison, there are 127 million travelers in the United States. So just in terms of the sheer volume, the sheer transactional potential, the Chinese travel market is more than twice the size of the United States. Now, of course, the Chinese traveler is very different from the U.S. traveler, but there's been just some extraordinary growth in China over the last several years. And so we're going to spend a few minutes on the presentation today talking about what we think of as PhoCusWright as this kind of emerging, this new traveler class within China, a very distinct population that is fundamentally transforming not just the travel marketplace in China, but a marketplace, the global travel marketplace. Now, every destination, every hotel, if you're thinking about that Chinese traveler, you've got to adapt every aspect of your service, your operations, your marketing to appeal to and attract a very different, a very distinct population of travelers who are growing by the millions and have very distinct kind of tastes and ambitions and desires. So we're going to be looking at this traveler population over the next 20 to 25 minutes. Now, one of the things I studiously avoid on online presentations like this is methodology in our research. It tends to be a little boring. So I do want to highlight that the presentation that I'll be, and the data that I'll be presenting today comes from a couple of different reports where we have lengthy discussion about the methodology and our approaches. Certainly happy to answer any questions about that at the Q&A at the end of the presentation today, but for the time being, we'll just kind of dig right into the fun stuff. So I'm going to look first at this traveler kind of population and some really key characteristics that are important to keep in mind to enable companies to be effective in engaging with the Chinese traveler. And first, one of the things that is really exciting, and I really love to kick off presentations like this with some good news, is this incredible enthusiasm, this hunger and optimism that Chinese travelers have for travel. It truly is unique within the global marketplace. And just to give you a little bit of context, so one of the things that we ask in our global surveying of travelers is we want to understand where travel fits in terms of travelers' priority for their disposable income, right? So you've got X number of free bucks in your wallet. Are you going to go buy an iPad or go to the movies or go out to dinner? Are you going to save up for a new car or save up for that big trip? And one of the things that really stands out in China, as you can see here, is that travel and tourism is at the top of the list for more Chinese travelers than any other kind of major category of spend, right, for disposable income. And just as a point of comparison, we asked the same question of travelers in the U.S. and Europe, and travel and tourism tends to fall kind of in the middle around kind of the fifth or sixth slot. So travel and tourism is a priority for Chinese travelers, and we're going to see this again and again throughout this presentation. I think it's important to keep in mind that you've got millions of new adults, consumers, coming into that traveler pool who haven't traveled before, but because of the incredible economic growth of China over the past couple of decades, we're now starting to see all of these travelers who have this new kind of financial wherewithal to be able to take those trips, and not only within China, but as we'll see abroad as well. So another way that we like to look at this too is, and this is again something that we ask among our global traveler surveying, is what are your plans for the upcoming year? Are you going to travel more or travel less? Are you going to spend more or are you going to spend less? And this gives us a sense of not only of what's to come, the outlook for the market, but a kind of underlying sense of optimism, a kind of enthusiasm for travel there, a sense of consumer confidence and traveler confidence. And you can see here, first we're looking at the data just for some key markets in Europe and the U.S., and generally, about 30% or so of travelers say that they are going to travel a bit more, they're going to take more trips or spend a bit more. It's a little bit more negative in the UK, where you have fewer travelers saying they're going to spend more and more travelers saying they're going to pull back a bit, where in the UK that recession has kind of lingered on a little bit more, though things are turning around there. But more or less kind of pretty consistent across these markets in Europe and the US. So now let's add China in there. Wow. So here you can see just a fundamental difference. I mean, this is really so extraordinary. I mean, I can tell you, as a researcher, when we go through our data, our survey data, and if we see a difference of a couple of points that may be statistically significant, then my team starts to get pretty excited. So a difference like this is really just it's phenomenal, and I think again it really speaks to this kind of an underlying pent-up demand and incredible enthusiasm for travel, right? Where more than half of all Chinese travelers say, yep, I am going to travel more and I'm going to spend more as well on my travel. Now, another really key thing to look at about understanding that kind of traveler psyche is motivation, right? So why do people travel? And there are some important differences around the world, and certainly for different generations. What inspires millennials here in the U.S. is very different from what motivates their parents who are kind of boomers and early seniors. So we always want to look at what are some of the core underlying motivators for travel. And again, this is something that we ask consistently in our global survey. And of course, one of the most popular common motivators is simply the desire to get away, right, and take a break. And especially in the U.S., it's very common for folks here in the U.S. We have the kind of the shortest vacation windows. Most of us don't take all of our days, and so we're kind of famous for that, right? So it's a very common thing, though, when we do get those days off, it's like, we just want to take a break, get away from it all, recharge our batteries for a bit, and you can see that it's one of the top drivers for U.S. travelers, and also it's pretty important for Chinese travelers as well. Now, another common motivator that we look at, of course, is seeing the sights, right? That's a really big driver. You want to get out and see the Eiffel Tower, go to the great museums, the great cultural and natural attractions of the world. So now let's look at the differences for China and the U.S. So again, here we see just a stunning, fundamental difference, right? So far fewer U.S. travelers is kind of culturally interested, right? Not as important to them to see the sights. Maybe more U.S. travelers are more experienced. They've seen a lot of these things. They have different types of ambitions for their travel. But you can see here, hugely, hugely important for Chinese travelers. Not only do travelers in China want to travel, but they want to see the world. They want to see the great sights, the great attractions. Hugely important for Chinese travelers in a way that is just not as important for travelers in the U.S. as well as in Europe. Now, another important thing to really understand around in addition to the drivers of travel is also the kind of the desired style of travel, the form that travel takes, right? So are you traveling with your family? Are you traveling in a group? And if you live in a major kind of destination kind of city in the U.S., maybe in New York or L.A., for example, you may start to see, if not already, lots of tour groups, right? Especially, it's a very common way as you have kind of emerging kind of consumer markets as they begin to move into the international tourism market. A very common way is through group, organized tours, right, where travelers can get together and they can travel out and see a new country, but in a relatively kind of safe or comfortable environment, especially if they don't know the language, they don't necessarily know how to get around. And as we can see, it is a fairly common means of travel for Chinese travelers. 1 in 5, so 20% of Chinese travelers have taken an organized group tour over the past year. If we were to look specifically at international travels, the international travelers, right, the incidence would go up quite significantly. So group travel, especially for outbound travel, much more important for Chinese travelers. But there's other forms of travel that are very important as well. Family travel, very important. A third of all Chinese travelers have taken a trip with their immediate family. A third have also traveled with friends, especially among younger travelers. This is an increasingly common way in which Chinese travelers are experiencing the world. Of course, the most common, right, is couples, whether kind of married or not, but couples travel is the most common means of travel. So nearly 60% of travelers have traveled with a spouse or significant other. But one of the most amazing things that we saw in our most recent study of China is the rise of the independent traveler. 2 out of 5 Chinese travelers have traveled solo, have traveled by themselves. That's a pretty amazing development, especially for a traveler population that is so kind of relatively young, right, or so kind of new to the global marketplace. So it's very important, especially if you are an international company, you're looking to attract travelers from inbound, so they're for international travel. Keep in mind that you're catering not just to those organized group tours, but to a growing population of independent travelers who are increasingly wanting to kind of see the world on their own and also outside of that traditional organized group tour. So we've looked at the kind of the mode of travel or the style in terms of the travel party composition, right? Who Chinese travelers are traveling with. Now let's look a little bit at destinations. And now we could spend lots and lots of time on this. So I'm just really going to look at kind of international versus domestic because it's that international traveler I think that we want to focus on today. And I'll just highlight here one of the things that really stood out and surprised us for our study is the extent to which Chinese travelers are traveling outside of China. It is a half, right? So half of that 256 million have traveled outside of the People's Republic of China. Now, we are including within that half the Greater China region, right, of Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan. Of course, a big percentage of that, a lot of those trips, of course, are the crossings into Hong Kong, without question. However, even if we were to pull out that volume of travel to the Greater China region, and we were to look at all travel outside of China and that greater group of Chinese destinations in Macau, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, we would still see that the percentage is about 31.5% of all Chinese travelers traveling beyond the Greater China region. So that's an enormous number when you think about, again, that 256 million. So the demand for travel outside of China is extraordinary. Not only is it quite large, but the future demand, that pent-up demand, I think is quite significant. And we can tell this by one very simple finding from our most recent study, which is we then asked all travelers, well, what's the likelihood that you're going to go overseas over the next couple of years and beyond the Greater China region? And when we looked at just those domestic-only travelers, so that percentage of travelers that have only stayed within China itself, 62%, 3 out of 5 say, you know what, I can see myself, I am planning to take a trip overseas beyond the Greater China region within the next 3 years. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they will. However, it is very clearly it's a strong signal of their intent, of their desire, and their expectation that they will have the financial ability, the wherewithal to be able to travel beyond China's borders. And that's significant because the number one impediment, of course, to why travelers have not traveled overseas is simply financial, right? Having the means to do so. So now we talked about a little bit about kind of where travelers go and that international demand. Now let's look a little bit at when they go, and not just when they go, but also how far in advance they plan. I mean, certainly there are some big kind of seasonal periods for travel in China. There's the Chinese New Year, which takes place towards the beginning of the year. There's a nationally promoted Golden Week holiday that's in the latter part of the year, and then the summer holidays as well are quite significant. But one of the things that I really want to look at here is advanced travel planning. How far in advance of travel do Chinese travelers tend to plan? And again, I'll look at this in comparison with the United States, with U.S. travelers. And again, the differences here are simply, I mean, I just think they're just so extraordinary that as a marketer going into the Chinese market, you've really just got to do a 180. You've really just got to kind of forget everything you know about about how things work in the U.S. and Europe, and you've got to really take a very local, very China-centric approach, because what you can see right here is just, it's just unbelievable, right? So when we look at the mix of looking at the last vacation where a traveler was choosing a destination, right? We asked them, how far in advance of that trip did you choose the destination? For those U.S. travelers, as you can see here, it's basically 2/3, about 63% said, yeah, we chose the destination at least 1 month in advance. It's basically flipped, right, for China, where a similar number or even more chose the destination within 1 month. And in fact, a majority actually chose the destination within 2 weeks. So we can see here very clearly that Chinese travelers are absolutely last-minute planners, and you see Chinese travel companies and online companies very much focused on this. It's a very price-sensitive, very deal-led marketplace. So we've talked a little bit about the planning window. Now let's look at shopping and purchasing. And I think in our world today around leisure travel, when we think about travel kind of planning and booking, I think for most of us it's really about online. Most of us on the leisure side are doing this online, and increasingly as well through our mobile devices, whether it is a phone or a tablet. And all of that is happening, to be sure, in China. But it's important to keep in mind that there is still a very big offline world within China, and that's something that travel companies must kind of contend with and be able to support when they approach the Chinese traveler and the Chinese travel market. So here, what I'd like to look at is simply the sources of information, the types of channels or sources of information that travelers use during the shopping process. So specifically when they are comparing and choosing different types of travel products. Again, I'm comparing here China and the U.S. so you can get a sense of how different these markets are. And you can see at the top, of course, more than any other source, Chinese travelers are going online. They're going to websites on a computer, either a desktop or a laptop, and there it's pretty similar with U.S. travelers. But what's interesting is you start to look at other sources of information, in particular mobile devices, as well as some offline channels. You see that Chinese travelers are much more aggressive users, much more likely to use their smartphones and their tablets than U.S. travelers, but also much more likely to use offline sources of information, such as calling and speaking to traditional travel agencies, as well as interacting with kind of friends and family. So Chinese travelers much more kind of aggressive, multi-source kind of shoppers and comparers. So it's very clear that as a kind of travel company today, you've got to be engaged both in the offline as well as in the online world to be successful. So let's dive into the online world in a little bit more detail. And of course, we could spend a whole webinar, or multiple webinars for that matter, just devoted to some of the dynamics within China's very distinct online travel ecosystem. But we'll just look at kind of a few things kind of to highlight, to call your attention to. So, certainly within China, you've got online travel entities that have kind of corollaries in the U.S. and Europe that I'm sure you're familiar with. So you've got online travel agencies, companies like Ctrip and Elong, and others that sell kind of a range of travel products and services that would be comparable to an Expedia or a Priceline or Travelocity here in the U.S. and also in Europe. You also have one of the leading sites in China, Qunar, which is a kind of a meta search site, but it's a meta search site similar to Kayak, where it searches across multiple websites to pull fares and rates and information for travelers to compare. But it's got it's a kind of meta search with Chinese characteristics. So it offers a range of products that meta search sites in the U.S. and Europe don't necessarily offer, and also facilitates booking in a way that's quite kind of unique to the Chinese market. And you've also got some interesting platforms in China that really have no corollary. I've highlighted two in that middle row here. Tunio, which is, in fact, just went public, listed in the United States earlier this year, which is really an online tour operator, a packaging site, offers both group and organized tours as well as independent packages. And then you have Taobao Travel, which is part of kind of the online shopping mall Taobao and the Alibaba Group, where this allows travel companies to basically set up a kind of a merchant store within Taobao to sell flights and hotels and packages. Kind of think of this maybe as like an eBay, but it's kind of much bigger. And as you know, the eBay is not as involved in travel in the U.S., but it's a major platform, of course, in China. And then you've also got in China as well a very different social ecosystem as well, social networking ecosystem, which is very distinct. Of course, you know, some of the big kind of Western social media networks, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube are not accessible within China. So you've got a very distinct ecosystem with very different kind of players. You can see here as well that the incidence of traveler use of different social networks is quite significant. In effect, virtually all travelers in China are active users of social networks in China. Several of them, in fact, most travelers are active users across multiple networks. Here's the incidence when we did our study late last year, but it's also very important to keep in mind that things change so quickly in China that what could be a super hot phenomenon at the beginning of the year may run pretty cold at the end of the year. So one of the fastest growing platforms, Weixin, WeChat, a kind of mobile messaging platform, has grown tremendously over the last couple of years. If we were to go back to the field with this study today, I think we'd see a very different figure than we did last year with the 58%. So it's really critically important for travel companies to, and really for all industries, to understand the importance of social and to understand the very kind of unique ecosystem and players within that market. And it's interesting, it's a concern for us in a study that we have, in fact, just completed a few months ago, a global survey of travel companies on their social media usage, and we asked them specifically about their engagement on kind of regional or local social networks. We found that the percentage of travel companies that are actually really engaged in some of the local platforms like Sina Weibo and WeChat and so forth within China is very, very small. Right? Less than 10% of companies, as you can see here, are actively participating in some of these really important networks, social networks within China. So this is actually a really big concern, kind of a wake-up call for the industry of our global sample of nearly 600 companies spanning airlines, hotels, online travel agencies, traditional travel agencies, tour operators, and so forth, destination marketing organizations as well, DMOs, not engaged in these networks. Critically important to understand and engage that Chinese traveler. You've got to participate. Of course, another really big topic as well is mobile in China. In effect, Chinese travelers, virtually all of them have smartphones, and they are very engaged on those devices. In fact, for many of these travelers, the smartphone is their primary means of accessing the internet. Nearly 9 in 10 are accessing the internet through their smartphone on a regular basis, and they're doing tons of shopping and also increasingly booking as well. And if you follow any of the kind of quarterly reporting of some of the big OTAs in China, like Ctrip and Elong, one of the things that they really emphasize is the extraordinary growth that they're seeing in mobile shopping and booking. And this is very consistent with what we are projecting as well for the market. Here's our projection for cumulative market growth from 2012 to 2015 in China. So while the total travel market is going to grow about a third, 34%, the total online market, everything purchased via the internet, is going to more than double by 116%. And mobile, as you can see, simply, utterly, off the charts. The column won't even fit on the slide just to consider how extraordinary the growth is. Of course, it's from a very small base from 2012, so it's starting very small, but the growth is going to be is already quite extraordinary. I think this is a really key thing to keep in mind, and I started with some optimism, and I want to close with some optimism, which is to kind of emphasize that while China has emerged, there's still a long runway ahead for growth. One of the and we'll look at this first in terms of how travelers are kind of typically how they typically purchase travel, and we can still see that a lot of Chinese travelers, a significant percentage, nearly 2 in 5, typically purchase travel offline, whereas a lot of that behavior in the U.S. and Europe has migrated from offline to online channels. So there's still a lot of behavioral shifting that we will kind of see over the next several years, although it's still important for travel companies to support offline as well as online booking. However, that shift will take place. One of the key benchmarks that we look at to kind of gauge the relative growth opportunity within any global market is what we call online penetration, right? So the percentage of all travel purchase that is booked and paid for online. And here we're looking at the 4 largest travel markets in the world in order. So China is actually the second largest travel market after the U.S. And you can see that online penetration, even in 2015 in red, it's well below the very mature markets of the U.S., Japan, and Germany. So even though we've talked about the enormous size of the market, the extraordinary changes that are taking place, very distinct characteristics of the Chinese market, there's still a lot of runway ahead for this market. So with that, I'm going to close and hand things back to Sharon, who's going to talk about some of the kind of specifics of kind of managing your digital presence in China for success. So Sharon, back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Douglas. That was really interesting. We have a few questions for you that I'm going to ask after I just present a few slides, only a few more minutes just to kind of talk about, basically it's such good news in China, so much growth and potential for more penetration in online travel planning, as well as just traveling overseas and outside of China. So how could a travel brand fail in China? So I'm just going to go over a couple ways that could cause failure and how to overcome that and get around that. So one way is basically what we call distance-induced latency. And what that means is if your company and your data center is located, say, in Europe or in the United States or anywhere further away from China, you're going to have an issue with latency. So you can see by this chart, a server that's located in London, so the website is hosted there. As you get into mainland Europe, it actually kind of doubles the time it takes for the site to download. When you get into Asia, you're talking about way more than doubling. You're going up into like 20 seconds, 30 seconds. And when you get to China, just because partly the latency of the distance, but also because you're encountering the Great Firewall, which we'll talk about in a second, it's pretty unacceptable. I mean, it could be 50, 60, 70 seconds to download, which people, are kind of used to little slower websites in China, but that's pretty crazy. So a lot of people think the way to go is to build a data center in Hong Kong and host from Hong Kong. You don't have as many regulations to contend with, but you then have the Great Firewall. So Hong Kong is outside of the Great Firewall. You're talking about potentially 40% slower if you're hosting in Hong Kong. You can see some times in this chart between a city that's within China and hosting outside in Hong Kong. It's just a lot slower, and you can see that throughout this chart, pretty much in every instance. There's also an issue, I'll put a data center within China, and I'm going to talk about it in a second, but you also have poor peering once you're within China between the ISPs. So just because you're in one city doesn't mean you're going to be fast in every other city, because the ISPs don't route things in an efficient manner. They don't peer well together within China. So the reason that you have this distance-induced latency is the internet is inefficient. When your server, say, is on the east coast of the United States, you're trying to get to China, you've got, a lot of paths, and you're being routed to different servers, and you never really know how long it's going to take because the internet is inefficient. You can't tell the internet, well, I want to go this direct path. It just doesn't work that way. And then you can see kind of once you're in China, you've got this poor peering. You could end up at one server in one city with one ISP, but then it doesn't route directly to the other ISP. So the whole thing is pretty inefficient. So what a CDN does for you is it basically creates a fast and secure tunnel over the internet. So CDNs have their own points of presence located closer to end users around the globe. So a global CDN like CD Networks, we have points of presence, which are basically servers and data centers located throughout the world and within China. So we route your website information, your dynamic information directly to your users, and we also can cache static images and that sort of thing on those servers closer to the end users. So we're quickly delivering websites and applications to and from China. There's no investment into a data center on the part of the travel firm, the hotel company, whatever, airline. There's no investment in new data centers, no upfront costs in hardware and software. And CD Networks has actual in-country experts to help with the licensing requirements. As you probably all know, you need different licenses on your website to operate in China, and you also need to be aware of content that might cause your website to be blocked. So we have in-country, we have offices in China, and we're constantly monitoring our customer websites. And then also, I mentioned the poor peering between the ISPs. So you really need to have a presence throughout China because the Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities are very important. A lot of people are located outside of the Tier 1 cities, so just putting something in one of the larger cities doesn't make a difference for those people in Tier 2 and Tier 3. So we have 25 points of presence throughout China. You can kind of see the locations, and we've strategically placed those to overcome the unstable peering between the ISPs. And just to give you a little idea of one of our customers, this is Tourism Victoria in Australia. They were realizing that a lot of people from China were looking to travel to Australia, and they wanted to reach them, but they realized also that their website was very slow, and the latency was causing problems, the availability from serving their website from Australia to China, it was poor. So they implemented CD Networks. They partnered with us. They now have 100% availability, very high performance on their China language website for Visit Melbourne. And it's optimized, and they had a promotional campaign recently, drove millions of Chinese speaking users to the website, and it was very successful, 100% available. So they've realized some big gains in employing a CDN to reach China. So just capping that up, the avoiding failures, don't assume that everybody is in the Tier 1 cities. And site performance degrades as distance increases. And you want to basically have a high-performing website with rich content, educational information, social connections, connectors to compete with the others in the market. And partnering with a content delivery network is really important, and you want to make sure that that content delivery network is not just in Hong Kong or cities outside of China. You want to make sure they have locations in China. So that is that, and we have a couple questions for Douglas, actually. Are you ready, Douglas?
Fire away. Good to go.
Okay, great. Let's see. So the demographics, one person wanted to know kind of the demographics of a Chinese traveler. Is it the retirees? Who are they targeting here?
Well, yeah, the Chinese traveler. It very much is kind of the young. It's a very young population. It's actually quite a bit different from what you see in the U.S. and Europe, where you see a fair amount of travel among younger adults, and then kind of a pickup, especially among the kind of boomer and early retirees that are enjoying as kind of empty nesters the opportunity to travel again. But it's very different in China, where it's overwhelmingly a kind of younger population. So we're looking at 20, 30 somethings, early 40s, where a lot of this travel is taking place.
Oh, good. Okay, and then kind of related to that is where do they want to go? What's popular as far as destinations?
Well, so first of all, some of that is very as you'd expect. So the majority of travel, of course, is domestic, and the big destinations are the big metros, the big cities. So that's Beijing and Shanghai, for example, within China. Once you start to look at kind of going outside of China, as you'd expect, the most common destinations are going to be the kind of that greater China region, in particular Hong Kong, also Southeast Asia, and some of the popular kind of package destinations, in particular shopping packages, travel packages to Singapore, for example, as well as some of the beach destinations across Southeast Asia. Northeast Asia is another very popular region as well. But Europe is also big, and it's a very high demand for Chinese travelers who want to see the sites in Europe, and also the U.S.
Great. Okay. And then why do you think, or why does PhoCusWright think that online travel penetration is lower in China? I know you talked a little bit about how there's such a big opportunity for that penetration, but it still is quite a bit lower than, say, in the U.S.
Yeah, well, there are a number of factors that are involved. I mean, so first, it's a market that is developing later, right? So e-commerce in general has been kind of slower to pick up than, say, in the U.S., but it's certainly gained its momentum, across a range of industries, and that's certainly the case in China. But there are some really big kind of infrastructural issues. Some of the things as well, Sharon, that kind of you referred to, I think speak to kind of some broader challenges in the industry, in the technology and kind of infrastructure industries, as well as specifically as how they relate to companies in China and in the travel industry. So just as an example, you have a very fragmented hotel market with lots and lots of independent hotels who don't have the sophistication or the financial resources to invest in technology, to have modern kind of reservation and inventory systems, to be able to offer online booking on their websites, or even to enable real-time connectivity between the hotels and some of the big online agencies. So, some of these agencies, in fact, are kind of actually giving away free technology to facilitate that connectivity. So it's very different from what you see in the U.S., where the hotel environment, it's really dominated by large kind of branded chains that provide a lot of that infrastructure and resources to the individual properties. So there's kind of technology challenges in particular on the hotel side, the airline side as well, although it's changing very rapidly, but the technology side within the airline industry has been slower to innovate and to adapt. And then there are other factors as well. There are things like the fact that digital payment, electronic payment is that whole landscape is very different in China as opposed to the U.S. It's here. Not only does everybody have credit cards, but at least until a few years ago, we all had 3 or 4, right? So that may have changed a little bit, but everybody uses their credit cards. It's very different in China, very cash-based culture. There are some shifts. So with platforms like Alipay and other online wallets that are kind of changing that a little bit. So there are kind of infrastructural things around payment as well that are impediments to online growth. But those things are changing, and we do expect that online penetration will. It's going to take a little bit longer, but we are going to see it, I think, over time start to approach more mature markets in the U.S. and Europe.
Great. Let's wrap up with one more question. You mentioned that 98% of Chinese travelers have a smartphone. How should hotel chains or any travel sites support that?
Oh well, I think it's important to keep in mind that whereas we in say the U.S. and in Europe, we were all travelers, or there was a very large and kind of robust traveler population within these markets before there was a smartphone market, right? So we were all traveling and kind of going, we were going to Europe or taking our vacations well before we all had, iPhones or Androids. So the smartphone adoption has actually come much later. But if you're in China, if you can stay and pay for a hotel, if you're going to fly by commercial air, then you've already got a smartphone. It's now the largest market just in terms of smartphone users. So it's just part of the fabric of everyday life. And as I've said, that for a lot of these travelers, for a lot of smartphone owners in China, it's their primary means of accessing the internet. And we've seen, in our research, and this has been corroborated with others, that there's kind of a relationship, a connection. They're more wedded to their smartphones than even kind of U.S. and European travelers. So I think it's really important for whether you're a destination, or a hotel. You want to make sure that you are offering services where you can engage and support that traveler through their phone, and that's across all stages of the life cycle. You need to be thinking about how you're going to support and engage that traveler through their phone when they're planning their trip, when they're making the booking, because increasingly they're going to book that hotel online. They may have some questions and may try to facilitate that through chat, like, for example, the WeChat platform or Weixin. They're going to increasingly post reviews and make comments about your hotel and your destination through their mobile phone on their social network. In fact, Qunar, the large meta search site in China, just last year introduced the ability for travelers to post reviews on their site, not only on their mobile app, but also through SMS as well. And when they did that, they saw a huge bump in the volume of reviews that are being posted. So when you think about the entire travel experience, it's the smartphone, the Chinese traveler and their smartphone are going to touch that across every stage, and you've got to really understand that and be able to kind of support that to your advantage.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Douglas. I want to thank Douglas Quinby, Vice President of Research for PhoCusWright, and thank all of you for attending. Have a wonderful day or evening. Thank you.